Yes, I mean, I can share about social order. I'm just not sure exactly what you want to think about, but in general, the way we think about social order is along two principal dimensions, right? We can think about social order as a vertical order, so to speak, an order of inequality, an order of social hierarchy. And we can think about social order as a sort of horizontal order, which is an order of groups and how people associate. And the digital society, you know, helps produce both aspects of social order. It helps people associate with others in ways that are very different from what they would do offline without digital intermediation. And it also helps create a new kind of hierarchical ordering or new kinds of inequalities that are sort of native to the digital society that partially overlap, but are partially different from you know, the inequalities with which we are accustomed. So that's how I'm thinking about social order in general. In the lecture, I talked principally about a hierarchical order, an order of inequality, where I explained that credit scoring in particular and other kinds of measurements of individual responsibility or reputation or status or honesty, however you want to put it, is a sort of new way of thinking about inequality. But there are, you know, there's other ways of thinking about social order. So I want you to realize that, you know, this is only a partial element of a broader theory of social order. So yes, data is a type of resource. It's a very interesting kind of resource because it is a resource that comes into being as a resource in the process of intermediation, right? It is not a resource that is lying out there. It is a resource that has to be, you know, created by the way in which we slice up the world for, you know, for data collection. So there's a whole way in which that resource is itself configured that is really important. So we, you know, we cannot think about the data as being sort of lying out there. We have to think about the ways in which it is pre-processed, if you will. And so that is very important when we think about the kind of power that, you know, that those who hold or own the data can exert. But of course, today, you know, it has become a certain kind of power because data is a form of, it allows for a whole economy to move, to be generated. And that economy relies on the one hand, what Shoshana Zuboff would call the instrumentarian power. That is the power to predict what people will do and to eventually manipulate them so that they will buy certain things or they will do other things. And it can be, you know, it can be thought of sometimes as things that may be positive to them, like, you know, behave in a more healthy way and so on and so forth. But it is nonetheless a kind of power because it directs what people will do. And there's of course another kind of power, which is a, you know, purely another type of economic power, which doesn't rely very much on advertising, but relies on the fact that the accumulation of data allows for the production of new kinds of technology. And here I'm thinking about artificial intelligence and machine learning as, you know, being technologies that demand very substantial amounts of data. So the more data you have, you know, the more performing, the better performing your AI systems will be. And, you know, and so we've seen, for instance, you know, the massive development of facial recognition systems, or automated translation systems, or you know, automated decoding systems, when you know, voice recognition systems, and so on. All of this, you know, is predicated on very, very large amounts of data, and so that's, you know, that allows these very large firms. And I'm thinking here primarily about American firms, but of course there's, you know, there are equivalents elsewhere, not only to have, you know, a profitable business in advertising and so on, but to develop other lines of business that are, you know, generated themselves by the sheer abundance of data. And so that's another, you know, that's another way to think about economic power. So these, you know, there's the accumulation of data reinforces, if you will, the centrality of the large data firms to the economy. There's a sort of feedback loop that contributes to further and further concentration. I think those are really terrific points. You know, I think, so the question of contract, of course, is exactly how Dr. Howe was talking about it, right? It is embedded in the architecture of the internet in such a way that we just do it, you know, very quickly, and we go, you know, we go to the next stage because we want to have access to that good or that service that's behind it. And it's not simply that we are lazy and we can't read like 10 pages of contract, but it's also that these contracts are written in such a way that, you know, people like us, laymen, wouldn't understand, you know, the sheer complexity of the legal language. So there's that. But I think, you know, I want to go back to a point that Dr. Howe made, and I thought it was really important, which is the point about, you know, AI, you know, in China being possibly way more powerful, facial recognition being possibly way more powerful than anything that Apple is able to develop, because of sort of the large, you know, much larger population. So that's one way to think about it. The other way to think about it is to think about it through the question of consent. That is, if you have a population that is, say, iffy about consent, right? And where data cannot be easily shared, it will possibly fall behind in the sort of international global AI race. And that is the tragedy of this whole thing, right? And I think we often don't capture well the tragic dimension of economic history. But there is always a tendency to, you know, the more we exploit, the more performing we will be. And so everybody, every country has actually an incentive to suspend consent. And in some way, you know, what you see that developed in Europe, for instance, around the GDPR, which are the rules to protect data privacy. You know, there's lots of people in industry who are saying, but with these kinds of rules in place, you know, we are falling behind in this other kind of power that I was talking about at the beginning, that we are also trying to develop, which is a sort of industrial power associated with AI. And that is, to me, a really, you know, a really important aspect of contract. And it's also why, you know, China is actually so powerful, because the question of consent for certain kinds of data is kind of moot, because the government just, you know, makes it a requirement for people to accept, you know, this kind of everyday surveillance in the urban environment and so on and so forth. So, for instance, my city, San Francisco, you know, near where I live, near San Francisco, you know, has banned public surveillance, facial recognition cameras by the city. Private companies can still have it, but the city cannot. And, you know, again, you compare that with, you know, a lot of cities around the world that have blanketed, you know, their urban space with facial recognition cameras. And that is allowing, you know, the companies that have access to that kind of data to make certain kinds of advances. And so there is this fundamental dilemma that all nations have to, you know, confront between, you know, the privacy of citizens on the one hand, and on the other hand, a very genuine claim to economic progress and economic, you know, advantage. It's a great question, and you know, there are always prophets who will talk about, you know, general artificial intelligence, that's what it's called, or super intelligence, you know, is just around the corner. And maybe it is, but most likely it isn't. You know, most likely it isn't, because there's lots of, that doesn't mean that there's not going to be a massive, you know, transformation of the economy, which will be very painful. Just like the Industrial Revolution was extraordinarily painful. It displaced lots of people. It, you know, threw them, you know, out of the, you know, the countryside at the time. So we have the same thing. You know, it will, the automation revolution will throw people out of the factories. It may throw a lot of service workers out of offices. But you know, I think the real, you know, the real danger of AI is not really super intelligence or the real revolutionary impact of AI is not that. It is what's happening today in reconfiguration of our social relations. And that is very real, and that is already happening, right? So what we're seeing today is, you know, we're seeing, first of all, there's this myth that AI works extremely well on its own, but of course we know that's not what's happening. We know that there are armies and armies of people, you know, working to correct the AI system, to help, you know, the taxi platforms match drivers to customers, you know, to moderate the content on Facebook's platform. And these are, you know, thousands and thousands of jobs, you know, very menial and very pleasant jobs, but, you know, very repetitive. But AI would not work without that entire economy, which, by the way, is very invisible. We don't see it, right? But it is very real. So that, and that's what we have today, right? We have, so the reconfiguration is in part a reconfiguration of class relation with a sort of, you know, what we could call a sort of underground cybertariat, you know, or if you will, digital proletariat that makes the whole system function. And the other thing is what I was saying before, and what Dr. Cho was talking about, which is, you know, the transformation around social relations through scoring and you know, the institutionalization of AI and scores and personal data and personal reputation in the management of everything, from indeed whether you can get credit from a bank, but that's not very new, to today, you know, who you can date. So there is an article today in the New York Times, you know, about online dating companies running background checks on you on the basis of, you know, really large amounts of data. So that, you know, that is very real. That those kinds of things to me are very real. The super intelligence, I mean, I think in part, you know, it's also industry hype. The industry has an interest in people believing that, you know, we are evolving toward a world where, you know, there will be no workers and so on and so forth. And the human race is, you know, going to be extinct. You know, I don't think this is happening anytime soon, you know, but between now and that, you know, very distant future, there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of transformations that will happen, and we need to attend to those because those are very present. And we need to understand, you know, how societies are changing accordingly. Yes, so thank you very much for the question. And you're absolutely right. Data is not oil. It's not at all the same thing. What is useful, you know, it's useful to think about the metaphor. And you know, I didn't originate the metaphor. It's somebody who wrote a report actually. But you know, the only way in which the metaphor is sort of useful is in the sense that data is reconfiguring the whole economy. You know, the whole economy revolves around data in the same way that, you know, the whole economy revolved around sort of energy provided by oil and coal. But, you know, to answer your questions about big tech and how can we, you know, how can we think about how can we harness the power of big tech? I mean, I think, you know, we tend to have a sort of fatalist attitude towards a lot of this, but of course it is completely in our power to change the way in which these services operate. And to me, for instance, you know, there is a possibility. Why not consider that certain kinds of services are actually public services? You know, that they should be organized as public infrastructures, you know, much like water or electricity. You know, it's the internet is a service that should be provided in that way. And similarly, why not think about search in the same way, browsers and so on. So there's lots of ways in which we could conceivably reconfigure the economy. And of course, part of what's happening in the United States today with, you know, the big antitrust actions against Google and Facebook is in part the public reclaiming, you know, a certain kind of power over these companies. So, you know, it's important that we realize that we have, you know, lots of tools at our disposal to rethink the way in which this economy operates. That doesn't mean that if we were to move entirely in the direction of socializing these infrastructure, doesn't mean that there wouldn't be other kinds of risk. And we would have to think about those risks. Are we ready to sort of, for instance, put these services under the umbrella of the state? Is that, you know, is that something, would we feel safer if that were the case, as opposed to, you know, the data is in the hands of large private companies? But that is a democratic question, right? That is a question for the people, so to speak, to decide. And that's why, you know, you are absolutely right to point out that, you know, it is at the level of legislation that this must happen. You know, this must take place.